Nobody wants that. The auctioneer laughed at the obese girl. The whole town roared, pointing, jeering, tearing her dignity apart in the dust of the street. But then silence fell. A giant Apache stepped forward, his voice like thunder. Count. Her bid. That moment should have ended the cruelty. But instead, it lit a fuse. Whispers spread. A widow clutching secrets. A barn set aflame in the dead of night. Shackles rattling in the jailhouse while church bells tolled. And behind it all, a greedy cattleman determined to crush them both before the truth could ever come to light. Because hidden in her father's old papers lies something more powerful than land, something worth fighting for. Worth burning for. Maybe even worth dying for. So here's the question that grips Bitter Creek. Will a broken woman and a hunted Apache prove everyone wrong? Will hatred win, leaving them both in ashes? Your reactions reaffirm something simple yet powerful, that stories still shape us, even in silence. If you believe in the soft endurance of love, truth, and doing what's right, then you're exactly why these stories exist. The late April sun blazed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the dusty main street of Bitter Creek. Clarabelle Whitcomb shifted her weight from one foot to the other beside her father's weathered wagon. Its once bright paint now dulled by years of Wyoming wind and weather. The familiar scent of sage and sun-warmed leather brought memories of better days, when Papa had been strong enough to drive the team himself. Around her, wagons lined both sides of the street, forming a makeshift corridor leading to the auction block. Families gathered in clusters, their voices a low murmur of anticipation as they waited for the Wentworth estate sale to begin. Clarabelle clutched her worn reticule closer, feeling the precious few dollars inside savings scraped together. Over months of mending for townsfolk who often paid more in pity than appreciation, the spring breeze carried snippets of conversation. Her way, shame about old Wentworth, a woman whispered. Left nothing but debts. Heard they're selling everything, down to the last milk pail. Another replied. Clarabelle's fingers worried at the frayed edge of her shawl. That milk cow could mean the difference between keeping her father's homestead alive or watching it wither like so many others. The memory of her mother's voice seemed to whisper on the wind. The Lord provides. Child, keep your faith strong. Perry. Callahan's booming voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. Ladies and gentlemen, gather round. The auctioneer stood elevated on a wooden platform, his suit too fine for the dusty setting, his watch chain glinting in the sun. We've got prime stock from the Wentworth place to day cattle equipment, household goods. Everything must go. The crowd pressed forward, and Clarabelle found herself pushed toward the back. She stretched up on her toes, trying to see past the sea of shoulders and hat brims. The first items went quickly: tools, furniture, kitchen, implements. Then they brought out the livestock. Here we have a fine Jersey milk cow, Callahan announced, gesturing to a gentle-eyed creature with a russet coat. 3 years old, gives 2 gallons daily. Who'll start the bidding at $20? Clarabelle's heart quickened. This was it, her chance. She'd calculated carefully, knowing she could go as high as $25 before her savings ran dry. The bidding started slow, but steady. $20. Do I hear 21? 21 from the gentleman in the brown hat. 22. Taking a deep breath, Clarabelle raised her hand. 22, she called out, her voice smaller than she'd intended. The auctioneer's rapid-fire patter stopped dead. Perry Callahan's eyes fixed on her, and a smirk spread across his face like oil on water. Well, well, he drawled, if it ain't Walter Whitcomb's girl. He paused, letting his gaze sweep her figure in a way that made her skin crawl. Though little ain't exactly the word, is it? Laughter rippled through the crowd, harsh, mean-spirited chuckles that seemed to echo off the false fronts of the buildings. Clarabelle's cheeks blazed hot enough to rival the sun overhead. She lowered her eyes to the dust at her feet, watching it blur as tears threatened. Nobody wants that. Callahan's voice rang out again, and this time he gestured not at the cow but at her, making his meaning crystal clear. The laughter grew louder, more cruel. Someone in the crowd made a sound like a pig snuffling. Clara. Belle's fingers clenched around her reticule so tight the coins inside pressed painfully against her palm. She wanted to run, to hide, to disappear into the ground itself. But her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Stand your ground, girl. You're a Whitcomb." The silence that followed seemed to stretch like pulled taffy, thick and suffocating. Then a deep voice cut through it all, calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Count her bid." The crowd parted like water around a stone as Nathaniel Lone Hawk stepped forward. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders straight as a fence post. Dark eyes fixed on Callahan with quiet intensity. His Apache heritage was evident in his high cheekbones and long black hair, tied back with a leather thong. But it was his presence, more than his appearance, that commanded attention. The laughter died instantly. Even Callahan's smirk faltered as he met Nathaniel's steady gaze. "I said," Nathaniel repeated, each word measured and clear. "Count her bid." A breeze stirred the dust at their feet, carrying with it the distant cry of a hawk. Clarabelle found herself holding her breath, aware of every heartbeat in the sudden silence. She didn't dare look up, but she could feel Nathaniel's solid presence beside her like a shield against the crowd's cruelty. Callahan recovered his composure, though his voice had lost some of its previous swagger. $22 bid, he announced, no longer meeting anyone's eyes. "Do I hear 23 when no one spoke?" he continued. "Going once at $22, going twice." The sound of his gavel hitting the wooden block seemed to break. Whatever spell had fallen over the crowd, sold to Miss Whitcomb for $22. Clarabelle finally dared to raise her head. The crowd was already beginning to disperse, their attention turning to the next item up for auction. But she caught more than a few backward glances, some curious, some shamefaced, a few still hostile. She turned slightly, meaning to thank Nathaniel, but he had already stepped back, moving with the fluid grace that made him such a skilled horseman. Their eyes met briefly across the dusty space between them. He gave her a small nod, just a slight dip of his chin, but in it she read volumes: respect, understanding, and something else she couldn't quite name. The cow's lead rope was pressed into her hands by one of the auction workers, and Clarabelle found herself guiding her new purchase toward her father's wagon. Each step felt more steady than the last, as if Nathaniel's quiet act of defiance had somehow lent her strength of her own. The Jersey cow followed docilely, her warm breath occasionally huffing against Clarabelle's arm. In that moment, standing straighter than she had in years, Clarabelle understood that sometimes dignity came not from standing alone, but from knowing someone else believed you worthy of standing at all. The auction continued, but the earlier, jovial atmosphere had transformed into something tense and brittle, like prairie grass before a storm. Clarabelle felt the weight of stares upon her back as she fumbled with the cow's lead rope, her fingers clumsy with lingering embarrassment. The Jersey's soft brown eyes gazed at her with gentle patience, a kindness that made her throat tight. With unshed tears, Perry Callahan's scowl deepened as he called out the next lot, his usual showman's flourish notably absent. His eyes kept darting to where Clarabelle stood with her new purchase, each glance sharp with wounded pride. The crowd's attention seemed divided between the continuing auction and the unexpected drama that had unfolded moments before. "Ma'am." Nathaniel's quiet voice startled her. He had approached without a sound, moving with the natural grace that marked his every action. "Let me help you with her." His strong hands took the lead rope, handling it with the expertise of someone who'd spent a lifetime around animals. Clarabelle found herself grateful for his tall frame, blocking her from the crowd's view. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the creak of leather and the stamp of hooves. "For everything?" The shame of the earlier laughter still burned in her chest, making it hard to meet his eyes. Nathaniel guided the cow toward her wagon with sure steps, his presence steady and calming. "Respect costs nothing," he said simply, the words carrying more weight than their plain meaning. He helped secure the jersey to the back of the wagon, his movements efficient and careful. The drive home seemed longer than usual, though it was barely 3 miles to her small homestead outside town. The wagon's familiar creaks and groans accompanied her thoughts as the cow plodded along behind. Neighbors passed her on the road, their wagons kicking up dust as they hurried by. She caught fragments of whispered conversations carried on the wind. "Did you see that Indian fellow? Walter. Whitcomb's daughter. Clarabelle kept her eyes fixed forward, trying to sit as straight as her mother had always taught her. The memory of Sarah Whitcomb's voice came clear as summer lightning. "Stand tall in storms, child. The Lord measures worth by what's in your heart, not what others see with their eyes." The sight of her homestead brought both relief and a fresh ache of loneliness. The small house needed paint, and the fence around the kitchen garden leaned in places, but it was home. The last home she shared with Papa before the fever took him last winter. She had to make it work somehow, had to keep his dream alive. Leading the cow to the barn took time and patience. The Jersey, whom she decided to call Grace, seemed willing enough, but uncertain of her new surroundings. Clarabelle found comfort in the simple tasks of settling her and filling the water trough, laying fresh hay, checking her hooves for stones. These were things she knew how to do, things that made sense in a world that suddenly felt more complicated than it had that morning, as sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Clarabelle prepared her simple supper. The familiar motions of cooking brought some peace back to her troubled mind. She soaked beans that morning before leaving for town, and now they simmered with a small piece of salt pork, filling the kitchen with a homey aroma. The cornbread she baked came out golden brown, though there was only her to appreciate it. She left the kitchen window open while she ate, allowing the evening breeze to carry in the sweet smell of spring grass and the soft lowing of her new cow. Grace was tethered within view, contentedly chewing her cud in the gathering dusk. The sight should have brought pure satisfaction. This was what she'd saved for, what she'd needed to help keep the homestead going. Instead, her heart felt divided, grateful for the cow, but heavy with the memory of public humiliation. A coyote called in the distance, and Clarabelle found herself wondering if Nathaniel was somewhere out there too, perhaps making his evening rounds at whatever ranch currently employed him. She'd seen him working at different places over the years, never staying too long at any one spread. Folks were quick to hire him for his skill with horses and cattle, but slow to treat him as an equal. Across town, the Last Chance Saloon blazed with lamplight, its windows glowing like angry eyes in the deepening darkness. Perry Callahan sat at his usual table, a bottle of whiskey keeping company with his wounded pride. His usual drinking companions gathered close as moths to flame, eager to hear him hold court. "Ain't right," Callahan muttered into his glass, loud enough for nearby ears to catch. "Ain't natural, her consorting with Indians." He emphasized the word with a sneer, pouring another drink with an unsteady hand. "Makes you wonder what else goes on out there at that homestead of hers." His companions leaned in closer, alcohol and malice making them eager for more. Callahan's voice dropped to a dramatic whisper, though it carried well enough to nearby tables. "Seen that Apache hanging around her place more than once? Who knows what kind of conspiring they're up to? Woman living all alone like that, taking his side in public. The whispers spread through the saloon like poison seeping into a well. Each retelling growing more elaborate than the last. Callahan sat back, satisfied with his work. The seeds of gossip were planted, and he knew this town well enough to trust they'd take root in fertile soil. "Mark my words," he announced to his eager audience. "No good'll come of it. No good at all." He raised his glass in a mock toast, but his eyes held something darker than mere drunken spite. The humiliation of being challenged, of having his authority questioned in front of the whole town, demanded an answer. And Perry Callahan had never been a man to leave a debt unpaid. Back at her homestead, Clara Belle washed her few dishes and prepared for bed, unaware of the bitter seeds being sown against her name. Grace's quiet movements outside the window provided a strange comfort in the darkness. At least she wasn't completely alone anymore, even if her victory in obtaining the cow had come at the price of public shame. She paused at her bedroom window, looking out at the star-filled sky. The same stars her parents had wished upon, had used to guide their dreams when they first claimed this land. "Help me be strong," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to the stars. To God, or to the memories of those she'd lost. "Help me stand tall in this storm." Morning light streamed across Clara Belle's small homestead, painting the weathered fence posts in shades of gold. She stepped out onto her front porch, a worn shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the early chill. The sound of hammering drew her attention to the pasture gate, and her heart skipped when she recognized Nathaniel's tall figure working at the broken hinge. He looked up as she approached, nodding quietly. His tools were laid out neatly beside him, a hammer, some nails, and fresh-cut lumber that smelled of pine. "Mr. Lonehawk," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I didn't expect, that is, you needn't trouble yourself." "Gate won't hold your new cow," he replied simply, testing the strength of a weathered post. "Saw it yesterday. Needs fixing." Clara Belle straightened her shoulders. "I can manage it myself. I've done repairs before." Nathaniel's dark eyes met hers, patient but unwavering. Nobody should struggle alone. She hesitated, then reached for a loose board. The rough wood caught her palm, and the post suddenly splintered in her grasp. Clara Belle stumbled back, cheeks flushing at her clumsiness. "Let me show you, Nathaniel," said quietly. He demonstrated how to brace the new post, his movements sure and practiced. 2 pairs of hands make lighter work. They fell into an easy rhythm as the morning wore on. Nathaniel would hold the heavy pieces steady while Clara Belle drove in the nails, or she'd fetch water from the well while he squared up joints. The work was peaceful, broken only by occasional instructions or quiet thanks. As the sun climbed higher, they paused to rest in the shade of an old cottonwood. Clara Belle offered him water from her father's old tin cup. "You're good with wood," she observed. Nathaniel ran a hand along the smooth grain of a fence post. "Learned young on Apache lands, before the soldiers came." His voice held no bitterness, just a deep solidity, like the earth itself. "My grandfather taught me to listen to the wood, to work with its strength instead of fighting it." "Where was that?" Clara Belle asked softly. "East of here." "Good land, with clear streams and tall pines." He paused, measuring his words. "When they moved us west, I found work at the cattle ranches. Some turned me away. Others hired me, but kept their distance. The horses didn't care what blood ran in my veins, though. They know a gentle hand." Clara Belle nodded, understanding something of isolation. "After Mama passed, it was just Papa and me. He taught me everything he could about running the place," said. "A woman should know how to stand on her own 2 feet." She swallowed hard. "The fever took him fast last winter. Left me the land and water rights, but there were debts. The cow, she's my chance to keep going." "Your father chose well," Nathaniel said. both in teaching you and trusting you. They returned to work as the day warmed. By afternoon, the gate stood strong and true, swinging smooth on its new hinges. Clarabelle tested the latch, satisfaction warming her chest at the solid click. "Would you?" She hesitated, then gathered her courage. "Would you take coffee with me? On the porch? It's the least I can offer for your help." Nathaniel considered for a moment, then nodded. Much obliged. Clarabelle hurried inside to stoke the stove and set the coffee to boil. Her hands shook slightly as she brought out 2 cups and a plate of yesterday's cornbread. They settled on the porch steps, watching the shadows lengthen across the yard. The coffee's warmth and familiar aroma helped ease the awkwardness. They sat in companionable silence, broken only by the soft lowing of grace in the pasture and the distant call of meadowlarks. "My mother would sit here in the evenings," Clarabelle said softly. "Said you could see God's handiwork best at sunset when the sky turns to painted glass." Nathaniel nodded. "My people say the same, that the spirits speak clearest between day and night." As dusk settled over the land, Clarabelle lit the porch lamp. Its gentle glow caught the silver threads in Nathaniel's dark hair, and for the first time in months, she felt the weight of solitude lift ever so slightly. Meanwhile, in town, Perry Callahan held court at Webster's Mercantile. He leaned against the counter while Mrs. Webster measured out flour for a customer, his voice carrying clearly through the store. "Shameful business," he drawled, shaking his head. "That Whitcomb girl, living out there alone, welcoming savages onto her property." He emphasized the word, watching it land like a stone in still water. What would her poor father say, seeing her take up with an Apache? Mrs. Webster's hand stilled on the flour scoop. "Surely you don't mean saw him there myself?" Callahan cut in smoothly. "Working on her fence, bold as brass in broad daylight. Makes you wonder what else goes on out there, don't it?" The customer gathered her purchases quickly, eager to share this morsel of gossip. Mrs. Webster's lips pressed into a thin line as she watched other shoppers draw closer, hungry for more details. "Never thought I'd see the day," Callahan continued, savoring his audience's reaction. A respectable woman like that, throwing away her good name. Consorting with, he let the sentence hang, knowing the townsfolk's imagination would fill in worse than anything he could say. The whispers spread through town like wind-blown sparks, catching and growing with each retelling. Women who had once smiled at Clarabelle in church now turned away, whispering behind their hands. Men who had tipped their hats in greeting found urgent business elsewhere when she passed. But out at the homestead, Clarabelle and Nathaniel sat unaware of the gathering storm. The lamp cast its steady light as evening deepened, a small circle of warmth against the growing dark. They spoke quietly of simple things: the weather, the taste of the coffee, the satisfaction of work well done. When Nathaniel finally rose to leave, Clarabelle felt something unfamiliar stir in her heart. Not romance, she was too practical for such fancies, but perhaps the first delicate threads of friendship, as fragile and precious as spider silk in morning dew. "Thank you," she said simply, meaning more than just the gate Nathaniel touched. The brim of his hat, "Good fences make good neighbors," he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his eyes. Then he was gone, moving silently into the gathering night, leaving Clarabelle to wonder at how a day that began with such uncertainty had ended with such unexpected grace. Clarabelle smoothed her best calico dress, checking her reflection one last time in the clouded mirror. The blue fabric, faded from washing but still presentable, had been her mother's favorite. She pinned her hair carefully, trying to tame the wild curls that always seemed to escape. The walk to church felt longer than usual. Spring wildflowers dotted the path, but Clarabelle barely noticed their cheerful faces. Her stomach churned with each step closer to town. The white-painted church stood stark against the morning sky, its simple cross reaching heavenward. She saw Nathaniel first, standing quietly near the hitching post. His dark suit was well-worn but clean, his hat held respectfully in his hands. Several townspeople clustered near the church steps, pointedly turning their backs as he approached. "This is a Christian house of worship," Bernard Webster declared, loudly, stepping forward to block the doorway. "For civilized folk only." Clarabelle's heart clenched at the cruel words, but before she could speak, Reverend Rollins appeared in the doorway. His kind face hardened as he took in the scene. "All God's children are welcome here," the Reverend said firmly. He extended his hand to Nathaniel. "Good morning, Mr. Lonehawk. I trust you're well." "Morning, Reverend," Nathaniel replied quietly. "I'll wait out here. Don't want to cause trouble." The Reverend's face fell, but he nodded in understanding. Clarabelle hesitated at the bottom step, torn between entering and staying outside in solidarity. "Go on in, Miss Wickham," Nathaniel said softly. "Your place is there." Inside, the familiar sense of beeswax candles and old hymnals couldn't comfort her. She felt the stairs boring into her back as she took her usual pew. Mrs. Webster's whispered shameless carried clearly in the quiet space. Someone coughed, savage lover, behind a hand. Clarabelle kept her eyes fixed forward, though her cheeks burned. She noticed several empty spaces around her where friends usually sat. Even little Sarah Miller, who always waved, now clung to her. Mother's skirts and looked away. Reverend Rollins took his place at the pulpit, his steady gaze sweeping the congregation. He opened his Bible with deliberate care. Today's sermon, he announced, comes from Matthew 7. "Judge not, that the be not judged." His voice grew stronger. "For with what judgment the judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure the mete, it shall be measured to you again." Clarabelle felt tears prick her eyes as the Reverend spoke of compassion, of Christ's love for all people. He reminded them how Jesus ate with tax collectors and sinners, how he touched lepers and spoke to Samaritans. Pride, Reverend Rollins declared, is the devil's favorite sin. It lets us believe we're better than our neighbors. It whispers that cruelty is righteous. It turns God's children against each other with gossip and false witness. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Clarabelle noticed Perry Callahan's scowl deepen with each word. After the final hymn, Clarabelle waited until most people had filed out before rising. Still, she couldn't avoid the cluster of women near the door. "Did you hear?" Mrs. Webster's voice carried clearly. "Perry Callahan says that Indians just using her to claim white folks' land. Says they're plotting together, taking advantage of her being alone out there. Well, what can you expect?" Another woman replied, "No proper lady would let a savage work on her property. There must be something going on." Clarabelle pushed past them, head high despite her trembling hands. Outside, Nathaniel stood exactly where she'd left him, patient as stone. Several men watched darkly as she approached him. "I brought something," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. She pulled her mother's small Bible from her reticule. Would you like to read some verses together? Later, I mean. There's a lovely passage about God making all peoples of one blood." Nathaniel's eyes softened slightly. "I'd like that." They fell into step together, walking slowly down the dusty road. Clarabelle was acutely aware of the stairs following them, but she kept her chin up. They passed Perry Callahan, who spat in the dust near their feet. "Careful now," he called after them. "Wouldn't want anything to happen to that pretty little homestead of yours, Miss Wickham." Accidents do happen too. Those who forget their place. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. They walked in silence until they reached the fork where their paths divided. "Thank you, Clara," Belle said softly, "for waiting, for being there." Nathaniel touched the brim of his hat. "Take care, Miss Wickham." He turned toward his lined shack, his tall figure soon disappearing into the spring grass. That evening, Clarabelle knelt beside her narrow bed, clasping her hands tightly. The familiar words of prayer caught in her throat as she remembered the hatred in those stares, the venom in those whispers. "Lord," she whispered, "give me strength. Help me stand tall like Mama taught me. Help me be brave enough to do what's right." Miles away in his humble lined shack, Nathaniel sat in the doorway. The moon painted the hills silver, and somewhere a coyote called lonely into the night. He thought of Clarabelle's kindness, her quiet dignity in the face of scorn. He thought of the growing danger his friendship brought to her door. The moon offered no answers as he sat in solitude, wondering if the price of their friendship would prove too high for either of them to bear. The morning sun filtered through Clarabelle's kitchen window, casting long shadows across the rough wooden table. She'd spread her father's papers before her, searching through the weathered documents for the seed bill she needed. Her fingers traced the familiar loops of his handwriting, each stroke a bittersweet reminder of his absence. "It must be here, somewhere," she muttered, carefully lifting another stack. The papers were a jumble of receipts, letters, and contracts, all stuffed into an old tin box her father had kept beneath his bed. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams as she worked. A folded document caught her eye, tucked between two feed store receipts. The paper was newer than the others, crisp despite its creases. Clarabelle opened it carefully, expecting another bill. Her breath caught as she read the official letterhead. "Water rights deed," she whispered, her fingers trembling. "Filed by Thomas James Whitcomb." The legal language swam before her eyes. But certain phrases stood out clear as day. Exclusive rights to Willow Creek, primary water source during summer months, bordering the Callahan property. Clarabelle sat heavily in her chair, the document clutched to her chest. Her father had never mentioned this deed, yet here was proof that their modest homestead controlled the only reliable creek that didn't run dry in summer. The same creek that Perry Callahan's cattle depended on. The morning suddenly felt colder. She remembered her father's warnings about Callahan, how he'd built his ranching empire by breaking smaller homesteaders. Had Papa hidden this deed to protect her, or had he simply never found the right moment to tell her before the fever took him? She needed to talk to someone she could trust. Nathaniel would understand the gravity of this discovery. Clarabelle found him mending fence posts near the creek itself, his strong hands working steadily with hammer and nail. He straightened as she approached, noting her troubled expression. "Miss Whitcomb," he set down his tools. "Something's wrong." She pulled the deed from her apron pocket, hands shaking slightly. "I found this today, going through Papa's papers." She held it out to him. "I didn't know. I never knew he'd filed for water rights." Nathaniel took the document carefully, his dark eyes scanning the text. His expression grew increasingly serious. "This creek," he said slowly, "it's the only one that runs strong. All summer Callahan's cattle rely on it. What should I do?" Clarabelle wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly chilled despite the warm spring day. "Callahan finds out. Guard this deed with your life," Nathaniel said firmly, returning it to her. "Lock it away, somewhere safe. Callahan would do anything to control this water." His voice dropped lower. "I've seen men kill for less out here." Clarabelle's fingers tightened on the paper. Papa must have known what it meant. "Why didn't he tell me?" "Maybe to protect you," Nathaniel suggested. "Knowledge like this is dangerous." But now, he looked downstream, toward where Callahan's property began. "Now you have power you never knew you held." In town that same afternoon, Perry Callahan sat in the saloon, nursing his third whiskey. The bank clerk, Timothy Weeks, stumbled in already well into his cups, despite the early hour. "Mr. Callahan, Weeks slurred, dropping onto the neighboring stool. Just saw something interesting at the bank today. Real interesting. Callahan barely glanced at him. Not now. Weeks? But. It's about that Whitcomb girl. Weeks persisted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Old Tom Whitcomb, he filed papers before he died. Important papers about water rights. Callahan's glass stopped halfway to his lips. What kind of water rights? To that creek that runs through his property. The one your cattle water at. Weeks. Hiccuped filed them proper and legal. He did. Gives her control of all that water, summer and winter both. The whiskey glass shattered in Callahan's grip. Several patrons turned at the sound, but quickly looked away at his thunderous expression. That mousy little nobody, he snarled, thinks she can threaten my operation? He grabbed Weeks by the collar. You're sure about this? Saw the filing. Myself, Weeks stammered. In the record books, Callahan shoved him away, standing so abruptly his chair toppled backward. She's already causing trouble, consorting with that Apache. Now this. His face twisted with rage. I'll break her. She can even think of using those rights against me. I'll crush every bit of fight out of her. That evening, Clara Bell sat in her father's old chair, her mother's Bible open on her lap. The lamp cast a warm circle of light around her, but the shadows in the corners seemed deeper than usual. The deed lay beside her, innocent-looking despite its power. She turned to her mother's favorite passages, seeking comfort in the familiar words. Her fingers traced the worn pages where her mother's hands had once touched. The responsibility of this discovery weighed heavy on her shoulders. "Show me the way, Lord," she whispered. "Help me be worthy of Papa's trust." Miles away in his humble lined shack, Nathaniel knelt in the gathering dusk. He faced east, honoring the ancient ways of his people. His deep voice lifted in traditional prayer, asking for wisdom and strength to protect Clara Bell from what was coming. Both of them knew, in their own ways, that everything had changed. The land that had seemed such a burden to Clara Bell, after her father's death, had suddenly become her greatest asset and her greatest danger. The deed lay locked in her father's strongbox, now hidden beneath loose floorboards. But its existence burned in her mind like a flame, illuminating both possibility and peril. Her father's final gift had given her a chance to stand against Callahan's greed. But it had also painted a target on her back. The weight of the water rights settled over her homestead like an invisible mantle. The creek's gentle burble outside her window, once a simple comfort, now whispered of power and responsibility. Clara Bell knew that come summer, when the other streams ran dry, every drop would become precious as gold. She closed her mother's Bible gently, her decision made. She would not let fear rule her, nor would she let Callahan bully her into submission. Her father had trusted her with this legacy, and she would prove worthy of that trust. The spring morning dawned clear and cool as Clara Bell loaded the last basket of eggs into her wagon. She'd wrapped each one carefully in clean straw, arranging them in neat rows. The trading would help stretch her meager funds. But the thought of facing town made her stomach clench. Nathaniel appeared at the end of her drive, leading his bay horse. He'd promised to accompany her, knowing she'd need support. His quiet presence steadied her nerves as they set out together, the wagon wheels creaking a familiar rhythm. "Beautiful morning," Clara Bell said softly, trying to focus on the purple wildflowers dotting the prairie grass instead of her worries. "Good day for trading," Nathaniel replied, riding alongside. His eyes constantly scanned the horizon, alert and watchful as they approached. Bitter Creek, Clara Bell noticed how people stopped to stare. Mothers hurried their children inside. Men gathered in clusters, speaking in low voices. The air felt thick with tension, like the heaviness before a storm. Outside the mercantile, Clara Bell carefully lifted her egg baskets while Nathaniel secured their horses. The store bell jangled as they entered, and conversation died immediately. Mrs. Peterson, examining calico, clutched her purse tighter. The store owner, Mr. Jenkins, merely nodded stiffly from behind his counter. They had barely reached the trading counter when Perry Callahan's voice boomed from the doorway. Well, well, if it isn't the water thief and her savage friend. Clara Belle's hands trembled on her basket, but she forced herself to turn and face him. Callahan filled the doorway, his face twisted in an ugly sneer. Trying to steal, good Christian. Folks land now, are you? He stepped closer, addressing Nathaniel directly, using this simple girl to grab water rights. The store fell deadly quiet. Nathaniel remained still, his expression calm despite the insult. But Clara Belle felt something rise in her chest, a warmth that burned away her fear. My father's deed is legal and proper, she declared, her voice carrying clearly through the store. Filed and recorded at the territorial office. She met Callahan's eyes directly. The water rights are mine, Mr. Callahan, fair and square. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. No one had expected such boldness from quiet Clara Belle Whitcomb. Callahan's face darkened. You dare she. Speaks truth, came another voice. Reverend Rollins stepped through the doorway, his worn Bible tucked under his arm. The territorial office confirmed it just this morning. He looked around the store. And I remind you all, the Lord commands us to deal justly with our neighbors. All our neighbors. The Reverend's steady gaze swept the crowd. Miss Whitcomb has broken no law, neither has Mr. Lonehawk. Let us remember Christ's teachings about bearing false witness. Callahan's jaw worked, but even he wouldn't openly challenge the Reverend. He spat on the floor and stormed out, shouldering roughly past them. The tension slowly eased. Mr. Jenkins cleared his throat and began discussing egg prices with Clara Belle. Other customers gradually returned to their shopping, though whispers still flew. Later, as they drove home with supplies traded for her eggs, Clara Belle felt lighter despite the morning's confrontation. The wagons swayed gently as they followed the rutted road. I was afraid, she admitted quietly. But having you there, I felt stronger somehow. Nathaniel rode silent for a moment before answering. Strength already lives in you. I only help you. See it, Clara Belle pondered his words as they parted ways at her gate. Inside her kitchen, she poured fresh cream into the butter churn, working the paddle with steady strokes. Hope and fear mingled in her heart like the cream slowly transforming beneath her hands. Across the prairie, Nathaniel returned to his line shack. He took out his tools, carefully honing each edge against his whetstone. The steady scraping sound filled the small space as the sun began its westward slide. His movements were methodical, but his thoughts remained on Clara Belle and the deadly anger he'd seen in Callahan's eyes. The churn paddle rose and fell in Clara Belle's kitchen. The whetstone whispered against steel in Nathaniel's shack. Between them, the creek flowed on, its waters now carrying the weight of all their futures. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks as Clara Belle led her cow to pasture. The past week had settled into a gentle rhythm, with Nathaniel arriving each morning to help with the heavy work. Today, he appeared through the morning mist carrying fresh fence posts over one shoulder. Got these from Miller's Mill, he said, setting them down. Reckon they'll hold better than the old ones. Clara Belle smiled, remembering how her father had always meant to replace those rotting posts. Much obliged. The north fence needs it most. They worked side by side through the cool morning. Nathaniel's strong hands driving posts deep while Clara Belle stretched wire between them. The physical labor felt good, honest. When the cow wandered over to investigate their progress, she bumped the water bucket with her nose, sending it clattering. Clarabelle couldn't help but laugh as water splashed their boots. That's Bessie's way of saying we're neglecting her. Nathaniel's quiet chuckle joined hers. She knows her mind, that one. By midday, they dug the first irrigation channel from the creek. The fresh earth, dark and promising. Clarabelle wiped her brow, watching water trickle down the new path. Pa always said, good water management makes the difference between surviving and thriving out here. My people know this truth well, Nathaniel said softly. Water is life itself. He paused in his digging, gazing across the prairie. Sometimes I dream of teaching others our ways of living with the land, not against it, if they'd listen. Listening, Clarabelle said. Their eyes met briefly before both looked away, shy smiles tugging at their lips. The days flowed one into another. They mended chicken coops, planted vegetable rows, and cleaned the barn. Clarabelle found herself sharing her mother's recipes while they worked, describing the herb garden she hoped to plant. Nathaniel spoke of Apache healing plants and the songs his grandmother had taught him for blessing new growth. Sunday morning brought them both to church again. Clarabelle sat in her usual pew, aware of fewer hostile stares than before. Mrs. Thompson even smiled warmly as she passed. Reverend Rollins' sermon spoke of Ruth's loyalty to Naomi, of how true friendship crosses all boundaries. Outside after service, Mary Jenkins approached timidly. Those eggs you traded last week were the freshest we've had. Would you be willing to trade regular-like? Clarabelle's heart lifted. Of course, I'd be happy to. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the yard, Clarabelle brought coffee to the porch where Nathaniel sat whittling a new handle for her hoe. The spring air carried the sweet scent of wild roses. Barn swallows swooped and dove, catching insects in the fading light. Sometimes, Clarabelle said, watching the birds' graceful dance, I think about how this place could be. A proper garden, maybe a few fruit trees, making it something PA would have been proud of. Nathaniel nodded, his hands steady on the wood. It's good land, with care it will provide. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, neither needing to speak what was growing between them. A friendship deeper than words. A shared vision of what might be. Meanwhile, in the stuffy darkness of the Golden Spur Saloon, Perry Callahan slammed another whiskey, his bloodshot eyes fixed on two scruffy men at the end of the bar, drifters with hard faces and worn gun belts. $100 each, he muttered, sliding coins across the sticky bar top. I teach them there. Place, make sure they understand how things work in Bitter Creek. The drifters pocketed the money without a word, but their cold smiles promised violence to come. Outside the saloon windows, evening shadows crept longer across the dusty street, but up at Clarabelle's homestead, the last golden light caught. The fresh-turned earth of new. Beginnings unaware of the darkness gathering below, the crack of splintering wood jolted Clarabelle from sleep. Smoke stung her nose, and an orange glow filtered through her bedroom window. Her heart stopped as realization struck fire. She scrambled from bed, her nightdress tangling around her legs. Through the window, she saw her barn engulfed in flames that reached toward the star-filled sky. The dry wood crackled and popped, sending sparks dancing upward like deadly fireflies. No, dear Lord, no. Clarabelle grabbed her mother's Bible from the bedside table and ran outside barefoot. The packed earth cool beneath her feet. Help. Somebody help. Her cow's frightened bellowing cut through the roar of flames. Clarabelle started toward the barn, but the heat drove her back. Tears streamed down her face as she screamed again, Please, someone help. A thundering of hooves approached, and Nathaniel appeared on horseback, returning from his evening ride in the hills. Without hesitation, he leaped from his mount and charged toward the burning barn. Nathaniel, don't. Clarabelle clutched her Bible to her chest, watching in horror as he disappeared into the inferno. Moments later, he emerged through the smoke, leading her terrified cow by its rope. His shirt was singed, face blackened with soot, but determination burned in his eyes. As he guided the animal to safety, the commotion had drawn attention. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness as neighbors hurried up the road. Clarabelle saw Reverend Rollins among them, along with the Thompson family and others from town. Then Perry Callahan's voice cut through the night. "Just as I warned you all." He strutted forward, his fancy boots reflecting the firelight. The savage set the fire himself, trying to make the widow dependent on him. No. Clarabelle stepped between Callahan and Nathaniel. "He saved my cow." "He wouldn't, course he would," Callahan sneered. "Saw him skulking around earlier myself. He's probably waiting for dark to strike." The gathered crowd muttered darkly, "Mrs. Thompson." Drew back, fear replacing her recent kindness. Even Reverend Rollins looked uncertain. "That's a lie." Clarabelle's voice shook with anger. "Nathaniel's been nothing but helpful. Step aside, Miss Whitcomb." Sheriff Holt pushed through the crowd, his badge gleaming dully. Two deputies flanked him, hands on their gun belts. Nathaniel stood quietly, dignity evident even through the soot that covered him. "I did not do this thing." "Sure you didn't," Callahan mocked. "Just happened to be riding by when it started." "Did you?" The sheriff's weathered face showed no emotion as he pulled out his manacles. "Got to take you in, Lone Hawk. Too many witnesses saw you near the property today." He was helping me. Clarabelle grabbed the sheriff's arm. "Please, listen." One of the deputies roughly pushed her aside. They surrounded Nathaniel, who offered no resistance as they chained his wrists. Someone in the crowd struck him from behind, and another blow followed. Soon fists rained down as they dragged him toward the road. "Stop it." Clarabelle tried to intervene, but strong hands held her back. She could only watch helplessly as they beat Nathaniel, forcing him to stumble. Along the dusty path toward town, the barn's roof collapsed with a mighty crash, sending a fountain of sparks heavenward. Clarabelle's legs gave out, and she sank to her knees in the dirt. Her white nightdress was now stained with soot and earth, but she barely noticed. Her cow stood trembling nearby, its soft moos like cries of despair. Perry Callahan lingered, satisfaction clear in his twisted smile. "Best forget that water right steed, Miss Whitcomb. Ain't proper for a woman alone to manage such things." He tipped his hat mockingly. "Shame about your barn. But that's what comes of keeping bad company." Clara. Belle remained kneeling in the dirt, clutching her mother's Bible as the last of the barn timbers crackled and fell. The crowd slowly dispersed, leaving her alone with the dying flames and the bitter taste of injustice. From the direction of town came the heavy clang of the jail cell door closing. Clarabelle bowed her head, tears cutting clean tracks through. The soot on her cheeks, her cow's mournful lowing, echoed through the night. A lament for all that had been lost to hatred's flames. Dawn crept over Bitter Creek like a timid creature, painting the sky in washed-out pinks and grays. Clarabelle's boots kicked up dust as she hurried down the empty street toward the jailhouse. Her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. Her eyes were red-rimmed from a sleepless night. But determination straightened her spine. The jail's iron-hinged door creaked as she entered. Sheriff Holt looked up from his desk, coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. "Miss Whitcomb, it ain't proper for you to be here. I need to see him." Her voice came out stronger than she felt. The sheriff's weathered face creased with discomfort. "You're just making things harder on yourself." Clarabelle pressed forward anyway, moving to the cell where Nathaniel sat on a rough wooden bench. Purple bruises darkened his cheekbone and jaw, but his eyes held the same steady strength she'd come to know. Her hands gripped the cold iron bars. "They had no right," she whispered, fighting back tears. Nathaniel moved closer to the bars, his voice low and gentle. "Don't carry that burden, Clarabelle. My spirit stays free, even here. I'll find a way to prove your innocence. I promise." She pulled her mother's favorite Bible verse from her pocket, the paper worn soft with age. Mama always said, "Truth is like sunrise. Darkness can't stop it from coming." Sheriff Holt's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. "Miss Whitcomb, I'm warning you kindly. Stop stirring up trouble. Some folks are already saying things that ain't charitable." As if to prove his point, children's voices drifted through the open window. Savage lover. Their sing-song taunts. Cut deep, followed by running footsteps and cruel giggles. Clarabelle's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin. "I won't abandon an innocent man, Sheriff. My conscience won't allow it. Won't allow it." "Your conscience might get you hurt." The sheriff wouldn't meet her eyes. "Callahan's got influence here, more than you know. Truth has more." But her voice wavered. Nathaniel's hand brushed hers through the bars. "Go home, Clarabelle. Take care of what's left. I'll be all right." The walk home felt endless. Whispers followed her down the street, and former friends turned away as she passed. At her homestead, the barn skeleton stood black against the morning sky, ash still drifting. On the breeze, Clarabelle forced herself to search through the rubble, salvaging what she could. A few scorched tools, bits of leather tack, a miraculously unburned feed bucket. The day dragged into evening. Clarabelle knelt beside her bed, her mother's. Bible open before her. Tears splashed onto the well-worn pages as she prayed for strength, for justice, for Nathaniel's safety in his cell. Nathaniel's voice rose soft and steady in an Apache prayer song, the ancient words a lifeline to his peoples. Strength. The melody drifted through the jail's barred window, carrying hope into the darkening sky. Meanwhile, raucous laughter spilled from the saloon. Perry Callahan held court at the bar, whiskey flowing freely as he boasted to his cronies. "That Indian. Hang sure as sunrise. Then we'll see how high and mighty Miss Whitcomb stands." The town felt split in two that night, those who drank to Callahan's victory and those who locked their doors. Troubled by the weight of injustice, but too afraid to speak, Clarabelle's candle burned late into the night as she searched through her father's papers, looking for anything that might help prove Nathaniel's innocence. The sound of coyotes echoed across the prairie, their cries as lonely as her heart. But in the darkness of his cell, Nathaniel kept singing, his spirit unbroken. And in her modest home, Clarabelle whispered her mother's words again. "Truth is like sunrise. Darkness can't stop it from coming." 3 days crawled by like molasses in winter. Clarabelle tucked a fresh loaf of bread into her basket, still warm from the oven, and added a jar of creamy milk from her rescued cow. The morning sun cast long shadows as she made her way to the small house at the edge of town where Thomasine Burdett lived alone. The widow's house needed paint, its weathered boards gray with age. Clarabelle knocked softly on the doorframe, hearing shuffling inside. When Thomasine opened the door, her thin face showed surprise. "Land's sakes, Clarabelle Whitcomb. What brings you to my door? Thought you might enjoy some fresh bread and milk, Mrs. Burdett." Clarabelle offered a gentle smile. And maybe a bit of company." Thomasine's eyes darted up and down the street before stepping back. "Well, I suppose you'd better come in then." Inside, the house was neat but worn, like its owner. Thomasine's hands trembled as she set out 2 chipped cups for milk. "Don't get many visitors these days," she said, settling into her rocking chair. "Most folks seem to forget about old widows. It's not right, being alone so much." Clarabelle arranged the bread on a plate, adding a pat of butter she'd brought. "My mama always said breaking bread together was good for the soul." Your mama was a kind woman. Thomasine's voice wavered. "Unlike some in this town nowadays, They shared the bread in comfortable silence. Thomasin's hand shook so badly she nearly dropped her cup, and Clara Belle steadied it without comment. The older woman's eyes grew moist. "Would you mind if we said a prayer together, Mrs. Burdett?" Clara Belle asked softly. "Mama also taught me that prayer helps heal lonely hearts." Thomasin nodded, and Clara Belle took her weathered hands. The prayer was simple, asking for comfort and peace, but when she finished, Thomasin was crying quietly. "Oh child, my conscience hasn't let me sleep." Her fingers clutched Clara Belle's. That night, the night your barn burned, Clara Belle held very still, like approaching a spooked horse. "Yes, I was up late, my arthritis acting up something fierce." Thomasin's voice dropped to a whisper. "I saw them from my window. Callahan's men, those drifters he hired. They were sneaking toward your place, carrying something." She shuddered. "I should have raised the alarm, but I was afraid. Callahan. He holds so many debts in town." "Mrs. Burdett," Clara Belle said gently, "it's not too late to speak truth. They'll run me out of town, or worse." Real fear colored the widow's voice. "The Lord sees your heart," Clara Belle assured her, "and I'll stand with you. So will Reverend Rollins." Thomasin's grip tightened. "I saw them clear as day in the moonlight. That tall one with the scar and the red-headed fellow. They were carrying oil cans, whispering about teaching lessons." Tears rolled down her cheeks. Then the flames, and that poor Indian man being blamed. My Herbert would be ashamed of my silence. Clara Belle pulled paper and pencil from her basket, carefully recording every detail as Thomasin spoke. The widow's words tumbled out like water from a broken dam. Descriptions of the men, the exact time, snippets of conversation she'd overheard. "I've been taking Callahan's side for years," Thomasin admitted. "He helped with Herbert's burial costs when I couldn't pay. But this evil, I can't bear it anymore." "Your words could free an innocent man," Clara Belle said softly. "I'm scared, child." Thomasin rocked slowly. "But I'm more scared of facing my Maker with this sin on my soul." Across town, Perry Callahan paced his office, worry eating at his gut. Something felt wrong. People weren't meeting his eyes like before. Even his most loyal supporters seemed uncertain. He pulled out his whiskey bottle. Hands unsteady as he poured. The truth he'd buried was shifting like sand beneath his feet, threatening to pull him under. But he didn't know that in a humble widow's parlor, courage and kindness had finally broken through fear's long silence. Clara Belle folded the paper carefully, tucking it into her Bible for safekeeping. "Would you like me to come by tomorrow, Mrs. Burdett? We could read scripture together." Thomasin managed a shaky smile. "I'd like that, child. I surely would." Morning sunlight streamed through the church windows as Clara Belle guided Thomasin Burdett's trembling form up the wooden steps. The widow clutched Clara Belle's arm like a lifeline, her thin shoulders hunched against imagined stairs.
"Are you
certain about this?" Thomasin whispered, pausing at the church door. "As certain as sunrise," Clara Belle assured her, patting the woman's weathered hand. "Reverend Rollins is a man of God. He'll know what's right." Inside, dust motes danced in. The golden light. The empty pews stood silent witness as their footsteps echoed on the plank floor. Reverend Rollins looked up from his desk, his kind eyes crinkling with concern at their early arrival. "Mrs. Burdett, Miss Wickham," he rose, gesturing to the chairs. Before his desk, "What brings you here this morning?" Clara Belle helped Thomasin settle into a chair before taking her own seat. "Mrs. Burdett has something important to share, Reverend." "About the night of the fire." The preacher's expression grew serious as he sat down, folding his hands on the worn desktop. "I'm listening, sister." Thomasin's voice quavered as she began, her tale gaining strength with each word. She described the moonlit night, Callahan's hired men with their oil cans, the whispered plans she'd overheard. Her fingers twisted in her lap as she spoke of her fear and shame at staying silent. Reverend Rollins listened intently, his weathered face grave. When Thomasine finished, he reached for his Bible, running his fingers along its leather spine. "You understand what it means to bear witness, Mrs. Burdett?" "Sir." She straightened slightly. "My Herbert always said truth was a Christian's duty, even when it costs dear. It may cost dear indeed." The Reverend's voice was gentle but firm. "Perry Callahan holds much power in this town. Speaking against him won't be easy. But you'll help us." Clara Bell leaned forward, hope bright in her eyes. "You'll make the truth known." Reverend Rollins stood, pacing to the window. Outside, Bitter Creek was coming to life, townsfolk beginning their daily routines. "The Lord commands us to defend the oppressed and speak truth in the face of lies." He turned back to them, resolution settling across his features. "I'll present Mrs. Burdett's testimony to the congregation on Sunday. Let them hear the truth before God and their own consciences." Thomasine dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "I'm afraid, Reverend. What if they don't believe me?" "Fear not those who can harm the body, dear sister." He smiled kindly. "Truth has its own power." After arranging for Thomas's safety, Clara Bell hurried to the jail, her heart lighter than it had been in days. The sheriff grudgingly allowed her 5 minutes with Nathaniel. She pressed close to the iron bars, speaking in hushed tones. "We have a witness. Mrs. Burdett saw everything that night. She's told Reverend Rollins, and he'll speak out on Sunday." Nathaniel's bruised face transformed with a smile, the first she'd seen since his arrest. The old widow found her courage. "Your dignity helped her find it," Clara Bell replied softly. She couldn't bear seeing an innocent man suffer. Perhaps the Great Spirit works through unexpected hearts. His dark eyes held warmth despite his circumstances. "Be careful, though. Callahan won't accept defeat easily." As if proving Nathaniel's warning, that very afternoon, Perry Callahan sat brooding in the saloon, his whiskey glass untouched. The bartender's nervous whispers confirmed his fears. Thomasine Burdett had betrayed him. "Saddle my horse," he barked to one of his men. That old woman needs reminding where her loyalties lie. But when his hired tough rode to Thomasine's house at dusk, he found Reverend Rollins sitting calmly on her porch, reading his Bible by lamplight. The man hesitated, then wheeled his horse around without a word. Inside, Thomasine's hands shook as she served the preacher coffee in her best china cup. "Will you stay all night, Reverend?" "As long as needed, sister." He accepted the cup with a gentle smile. Evil thrives in darkness, but it cannot stand against the light of truth. The Reverend spent the evening hours carefully crafting his Sunday sermon, his pencil moving steadily across the page. Scripture verses about justice and bearing false witness filled the margins. Outside, crickets chirped in the growing darkness, while inside, lamplight illuminated the path of righteousness, being laid out word by word. "The Lord tests the righteous and the wicked," he wrote, "and the one who loves violence, his soul hates." His pencil paused as he considered the cost of confronting Callahan's power. But the image of Nathaniel in chains, of Clara Bell's quiet courage, of Thomasine's trembling confession, these strengthened his resolve. A soft knock interrupted his writing. Clara Bell stood at the door with a basket of fresh biscuits and cold chicken. "Thought you might need sustenance for your guard duty, Reverend." He welcomed her inside, where Thomasine had dozed off in her rocking chair, her Bible open in her lap. "The Lord provides through caring hearts," he said, breaking bread with Clara Bell in the quiet kitchen. "Do you think the town will listen?" She asked softly, spreading butter on a warm biscuit. The Reverend considered his response carefully. "Some will resist. Truth often meets opposition. But others will recognize God's hand in this. how he used a lonely widow's testimony to reveal hidden evil. Clarabelle nodded, her eyes distant. Nathaniel says the Great Spirit works through unexpected hearts. Indeed, he does. Reverend Rollins smiled. Through a gentle-hearted woman standing against cruelty. Through an Apache man showing Christ-like dignity in chains. Through an old widow choosing truth over fear. They shared a quiet prayer before Clarabelle left. The Reverend returned to his sermon, adding final touches as the night deepened. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, but for now, truth was finding its voice in the stillness in his jail cell. Nathaniel sang softly in Apache, a prayer of thanksgiving rising like smoke to the stars. In her humble home, Clarabelle knelt by, her bed adding her own prayers to his, and in her chair, Thomasine slept peacefully for the first time since the fire. Her conscience finally clear. Outside her window, Reverend Rollins kept his vigil, his Bible open on his lap, while all around them Bitter Creek held its breath. Waiting for Sunday's revelation of truth, the church pews creaked under the weight of the entire town that Sunday morning. Every soul in Bitter Creek had come to worship, packed shoulder to shoulder in their Sunday best. Only Clarabelle sat alone, feeling the empty space beside her like a physical ache. Through the window, she could see the jail where Nathaniel remained under guard. Morning light filtered through the painted glass, casting colored shadows across worn hymnals. The air hung heavy with June heat and tension. Perry Callahan lounged in his usual spot near the front, hat placed carefully beside him, his expression smug. Reverend Rollins mounted the pulpit with measured steps. His weathered Bible lay open. Before him, pages rustling in the breeze from the open windows. The usual morning pleasantries were absent from his face. Let us turn to Exodus, chapter 20. His voice carried clear and strong through the hushed sanctuary. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Clarabelle's hands tightened around her mother's Bible. In the back pew, Thomasine Burdette dabbed at her face with a handkerchief. The Lord commands us to speak truth, Rollins continued, his gaze sweeping the congregation. To remain silent in the face of injustice is to participate in sin itself. The floorboards creaked as people shifted uncomfortably. The Reverend's words hung in the air like summer lightning. 3 nights ago, our community witnessed a terrible act, the burning of Miss Whitcomb's barn. An innocent man sits in chains, condemned by rumors and fear. He paused, letting the weight of truth settle. But God has brought forth a witness. Callahan's head snapped up, his face darkening. Mrs. Thomasine Burdette has testified that she saw 2 men hired by Mr. Perry Callahan set that fire in the dark of night. Gasps rippled through the church. Women clutched their bonnets, whispering behind raised hands. Men's faces grew grave. That's a lie. Callahan exploded to his feet, his voice thundering. That addled widow's mind is playing tricks. No. Thomasine's quavering voice cut through his protest as she rose, trembling but straight-backed. I saw them plain as day in the moonlight. Your men, Perry Callahan, with their oil cans and matches. I saw them run from that barn as the flames took hold. The silence that followed, even the birds seemed to halt their song outside. The windows, you dare to. Callahan started forward, face purple with rage. That's enough. Sheriff Holt's voice cracked like a whip as he stood, one hand on his gun belt. His weathered face had grown hard as granite. Perry Callahan, you're under arrest for arson and bearing false witness. You can't believe this foolishness. Callahan backed away, looking wildly around at faces that had once smiled at his jokes, now turned cold with judgment. The truth reveals itself, Rollins said quietly from the pulpit, as it always must. Clarabelle pressed her hands to her mouth, tears sliding down her cheeks as she watched the sheriff lead a protesting Callahan from the church. All around her, The congregation murmured as the full weight of their mistakes settled over them. Through the open doors, they saw young Tommy Wheeler leap onto his pony, spurring it toward the jail to carry word of Nathaniel's vindication. The thunder of hooves faded into the morning air as Reverend Rollins bowed his head to pray. "Lord," he began, his voice gentle but firm, "grant us the wisdom to see past our prejudices and the courage to stand for truth." Scene 1. Afternoon of redemption. The afternoon sun-bathed Bitter Creek's jail in golden light as Sheriff Holt fumbled with the iron keys. Each click of the lock echoed through the hushed street where townsfolk gathered, their faces a mix of shame and curiosity. Clara Bell stood at the front of the crowd, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild bird seeking freedom. The cell door groaned open. Nathaniel emerged slowly, dignity wrapped around him like a cloak despite his bruised face and dusty clothes. His eyes found Clara Bell's instantly, and the connection between them hummed like a plucked guitar string. Without hesitation, Clara Bell crossed the space between them, her arms wrapped around his broad shoulders, face pressed against his chest. She felt his sharp intake of breath, then his gentle embrace enfolding her. Someone in the crowd gasped, but Clara Bell didn't care. The steady thump of Nathaniel's heart against her ear drowned out everything else. "You're free," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "Thanks to your courage," he murmured back, his hand warm against her back. Sheriff Holt cleared his throat awkwardly. "Mr. Lonehawk," he said, his weathered face creased with discomfort. "Seems we owe you an apology. I should have looked harder for the truth." Nathaniel nodded once, accepting the words without bitterness. "A man can only see what he's willing to look for, Sheriff." Down the street, raised voices drew their attention. Perry Callahan, hands bound, was being led from the mercantile by Deputy Matthews. His fine wool suit was rumpled, his face mottled with rage as he shouted, "You're all making a mistake. Everything I built here was built on lies." Reverend Rollins's steady voice cut through Callahan's protests. The preacher stood on the boardwalk, hands clasped behind his back. "The Lord's light reveals all things in time, Mr. Callahan. Your empire of deceit has crumbled." Clara Bell watched as several businessmen approached Callahan, papers clutched in their hands. The bank president spoke first, his words carrying clearly. "Your notes are called in, Perry. The bank's foreclosing on your holdings. Best you settle your accounts and move on." Callahan's face drained of color. "You can't, we can, and we have." The bank president's voice was firm. "No one in Bitter Creek will do business with a man who burns his neighbor's barns and frames innocent men." Deputy Matthews tugged Callahan toward the jail as the fallen cattleman's protests dissolved into incoherent cursing. Clara Bell felt Nathaniel's hand tighten protectively on her shoulder. "Truth prevails," Reverend Rollins said quietly, approaching them. "Though sometimes we must weather storms before seeing its light." He smiled warmly at them both. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, bringing hearts together despite man's prejudices, Clara." Bell blushed, but didn't step away from Nathaniel's side. The Reverend's approval felt like a balm after weeks of judgment. The crowd began to disperse, but several people approached them hesitantly. Mrs. Peterson from the millinery shop pressed a fresh shirt into Nathaniel's hands. Tom Wheeler, the livery stable owner, offered his hand in friendship. One by one, neighbors stepped forward with small gestures of reconciliation. "We've got something to show you, Miss Whitcomb." Young Tommy Wheeler burst out, unable to contain his excitement. "Out at your place." Clara Bell exchanged a puzzled look with Nathaniel. They borrowed Tom Wheeler's wagon, and as they drove toward her homestead, the reason for Tommy's excitement became clear. At least 24 people were gathered at her burned-out barn. The charred timbers had been cleared away, and fresh lumber was stacked neatly. Men worked together raising new support beams while women laid out a potluck dinner on makeshift tables. "We figured it was time to make things right," Tom Wheeler said gruffly from the driver's seat. Barn raising seemed a good start. Clara Belle's vision blurred with tears as she watched her neighbors working together. Mrs. Peterson and her daughters were setting up food. The blacksmith's boys carried water for the workers. Even Thomasine Burdette sat in a rocking chair someone had brought, piecing together a quilt for Clara Belle's home. The wagon stopped, and Nathaniel helped Clara Belle down, his touch gentle. The workers paused, looking uncertain for a moment, until Reverend Rollins stepped forward. "Brother Nathaniel," he said warmly, "we could surely use your strength with these beams." The tension broke. Men called out welcomes, offering Nathaniel tools. Women drew Clara Belle toward the food tables, asking her advice on where things should go. The afternoon filled with the sounds of hammering, laughter, and honest work as the sun began to set. Casting long shadows across the newly framed barn, the workers began gathering their tools. Families drifted homeward, leaving behind a transformed homestead, and Clara Belle hoped transformed hearts. She stood on her porch, watching the last golden light paint the hills. Nathaniel approached slowly, his shirt dusty from work. Without speaking, he knelt in the dirt before her steps. Clara Belle's heart skipped, then steadied as she saw not proposal in his eyes, but something deeper. "Clara Belle," he said, his deep voice carrying all the warmth of the setting sun, "I don't come with a ring or promises of riches. But I ask if you would walk beside me in life's path. Share burdens and joys alike. Be partners in whatever storms or sunshine the Lord sends our way." Tears spilled down Clara Belle's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "I reckon that's the finest offer I've ever heard," she said softly. "Yes, Nathaniel, I'll walk beside you, come what may." He rose then, taking her work-roughened hands in his. They stood together on the porch steps, watching the evening star appear above the new barn frame. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, its hope bloomed as sweet as evening primrose in the gathering dusk. The new barn stood tall against the Wyoming sky, its fresh-cut timber gleaming golden in the morning light. Clara Belle paused at the door, running her hand along the smooth planks. The wood felt solid, dependable, so different from the old barn that had burned. Neighbors had joined together, bringing lumber and strong backs to rebuild it even sturdier than before. Inside, the spring sunlight filtered through the high windows, catching dust motes that danced in the air. The sweet smell of fresh hay filled her nose, and the cow, now named Hope, greeted her with a gentle moo from her stall. Clara Belle smiled, remembering how that cow had started everything at the auction those months ago. The creek burbled outside, its waters running clear and strong with the spring melt. She could hear it from the barn doorway, a constant reminder of her father's foresight in securing those precious water rights. The deed itself lay safe in her cedar chest, but its power flowed through the land, bringing life to pastures that had once threatened to wither. Morning, Nathaniel's deep voice came from behind her. He carried 2 pails, ready for the morning milking. The sight of him, tall and steady in the doorway, made her heart flutter just as it had that first day. He defended her. "You're early," she said, though she'd come to expect his presence with the sunrise. "Thought we might check the irrigation channels after milking," he replied. The meltwater's running high. They worked together in comfortable silence, the rhythm of their morning chores as natural as breathing. Hope stood patient while they milked, her tail swishing occasionally at flies. Through the barn door, Clara Belle could see the fresh-turned earth where Nathaniel had helped her plant a vegetable garden the week before. The changes in town had come slowly, like ice thawing after a hard winter. First, it was Mrs. Peterson, nodding to her at the mercantile instead of turning away. Then, old Mr. Jenkins actually tipped his hat when she passed. The whispers still came sometimes, but they carried a different tone now, more wondering than cruel. Reverend Rollins asked if we'd help with the church social next week. Clarabelle mentioned as they carried the milk pails toward the house. Said he wants your fry bread there alongside my pies. Nathaniel's eyes crinkled at the corners. Reckon that's his way of making a point. He's good at that, Clarabelle agreed. The preacher had become their steadfast ally, using his pulpit to gentle hearts and open minds. One sermon at a time. Last Sunday had marked a milestone she'd never expected to see. She and Nathaniel had walked into church together, and for the first time, no one had protested when they sat in the same pew. The moment had brought tears to her eyes, though she'd blinked them back quickly. Later that afternoon, they sat together on her porch, watching thunderheads build over the distant mountains. The air felt heavy with coming rain, but Clarabelle welcomed it. The land needed the moisture, and she'd learned not to fear storms anymore. "Remember what you told me that first day?" she asked softly. "About respect costing nothing." Nathaniel nodded, his eyes on the horizon. "Seems like some folks are finally learning that lesson," she continued. "Mrs. Thomasine brought over a jar of preserves yesterday. Said she wanted to make things right." "People can change," Nathaniel said simply, "when truth shows them the way." The truth had indeed carved a new path through Bitter Creek, like spring waters cutting through winter ice. Perry Callahan's lies had poisoned the town for a time, but in the end, truth had won out. Last she'd heard, he'd ended up in Colorado. His influence here washed away like mud after a storm. That evening, Clarabelle set her table with care. The good plates her mother had left her, or a fresh loaf of bread and a bowl of early spring greens from her garden. Nathaniel arrived just as the sun began to set, bringing a string of fresh-caught trout. Hope's gentle lowing drifted through the open window as they sat down to supper. The lamplight cast a warm glow across the wooden table, catching the silver threads in Nathaniel's dark hair and softening the worry lines that had etched themselves around Clarabelle's eyes during the hard times. Lord Clarabelle spoke quietly, closing her eyes for grace. "We thank you for the storms that brought us to new dawns, for truth that overcomes darkness, and for hearts that can learn to see with new eyes." "Amen," Nathaniel murmured. When she opened her eyes, she found him watching her with that steady gaze that had first given her courage at the auction. The same strength that had helped her stand tall when the town turned against them both. "The land is healing," he said softly. "So are we." Clarabelle looked out her window at the new barn, the flowing creek, and the gardens stretching toward tomorrow's sun. She thought of the town slowly opening its heart, of Reverend Rollins' gentle guidance, and of the partnership that had grown between her and Nathaniel, strong as the timber in her barn, deep as the water rights her father had left her. "Yes," she agreed, peace settling in her heart like a dove coming to rest. "We surely are." Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.